I should have known starting over with Lucas Hale would feel exactly the same as being thrown into a storm and told it was just light rain. Because the moment I stepped onto campus the next morning, it wasn't quieter, it wasn't easier, it wasn't anything close to normal. It was worse, because now people weren't just staring, they were watching like they already knew something I didn't. Like they were waiting for me to slip up and prove whatever story they had built overnight. And I felt it. Immediately, that shift in the air, that low hum of attention that followed me from the parking lot all the way to the front doors. Phones not even hidden anymore. Just held casually at chest level like recording someone's life had become routine. And I told myself to breathe, to walk, to act like yesterday hadn't flipped everything upside down. Except that was impossible when my phone buzzed nonstop in my pocket. Messages from numbers I didn't recognize, notifications stacking faster than I could process. And when I finally glanced down, it wasn't just school anymore. It was everywhere. Clips, comments, edits, people analyzing the way Lucas had looked at me like it meant something deeper, people arguing whether it was fake or real. And right in the middle of it all, one comment kept showing up over and over again. Repeated, liked, pushed to the top like it mattered more than everything else. He's lying. And I didn't know who posted it, didn't know what it meant, but it stuck in my head in a way the others didn't. Sharp and quiet and impossible to ignore. And that was when I saw him, leaning against the same entrance pillar like he had been there long before I arrived. Calm, composed, untouched by the chaos surrounding him. Lucas Hale didn't look like someone whose life had just gone viral overnight. He looked like someone who had expected it, planned for it. And that should have reassured me, except it didn't. It made everything feel more calculated, more controlled. Like I was still a step behind something bigger than I understood. And when his eyes found mine, there was that same brief shift, that same moment where his expression softened just enough to feel real before settling back into something unreadable. "You're early," he said as I approached, like we were just two people meeting up before class, like half the school wasn't pretending not to listen, and I huffed a quiet breath, adjusting the strap of my bag more to ground myself than anything else. "You're everywhere," I muttered instead, because that felt closer to the truth, and for a second, just a second, the corner of his mouth twitched like he almost smiled. Almost, but then it was gone, replaced by that same steady calm. "So are you," he replied, and I didn't have a comeback for that because he wasn't wrong. I was everywhere now too, whether I wanted to be or not, and the realization sat heavy in my chest as we started walking, his pace matching mine automatically, close but not touching. Not yet, and somehow that almost distance felt louder than anything else, like everyone was waiting for him to close it, to confirm the version of us they had already decided was real, and I wondered if he felt it too, that pressure, that expectation, but if he did, he didn't show it, he never did, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, because I couldn't tell where the performance ended and where he began, and before I could push that thought any further, my phone buzzed again, sharper this time. More insistent, and against my better judgment, I checked it, only to feel my stomach drop as a new post loaded onto the screen. Not a clip, not an edit, something else, a screenshot. A headline: Lucas Hale's reputation isn't as perfect as you think, followed by a thread of comments dissecting his past, mentioning Claire, suggesting things I didn't fully understand but definitely didn't sound harmless. And I slowed without meaning to, my steps faltering just enough for him to notice. Of course he noticed. He always noticed. "What is it?" he asked quietly, and I hesitated for half a second before turning the screen toward him, watching carefully, waiting for some kind of reaction, surprise, frustration, anything. But his expression didn't change immediately. It stayed controlled, measured, like he was processing it in real time without letting any of it show, and that should have reassured me. Except it didn't. It made that comment echo louder in my head. He's lying. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not exactly, but doubt, quiet and creeping, settling in the spaces where trust was supposed to be. And when he finally looked up from the screen, his gaze steady but just a fraction tighter than before, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that moment. Starting over didn't mean the story reset. It just meant I was deeper in it now. And whatever Lucas wasn't telling me was already starting to catch up. He did not deny it. And somehow that was worse than if he had laughed it off or told me it was nothing. Because Lucas Hale was many things, but he was not careless with silence. And the way he held my phone for half a second longer than necessary before handing it back told me he already knew this was coming, like the post, the comments, the shift in how people were. Looking at him was not a surprise, but a delayed reaction, something he had been waiting for to surface, and that realization settled heavy in my chest as we kept walking, the hallway louder now, sharper, like every whisper carried more weight even if I could not make out the words. "It is just noise," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, like he was addressing something small instead of something that had already started spreading beyond the walls of this school. And I almost let it go, almost nodded and pretended that answer was enough. But the comment was still there in my head, repeating, steady and certain, "He is lying." And I could not ignore it anymore. "That does not look like noise," I replied quietly, keeping my voice low even though it felt like everyone could hear it anyway. Like this conversation was just another piece of content waiting to be picked apart. And for the first time since I had known him, Lucas did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting forward, instead of toward me, his jaw tightening just slightly, subtle enough that no one else would notice but clear enough that I did. And that tiny crack in his composure did more than any explanation could have. Because it confirmed what I had been starting to feel since yesterday, that there were layers here I was not seeing, things he was choosing not to say, and I was standing right in the middle of them whether I wanted to be or not. "People like to make things bigger than they are," he said after a moment. And it sounded right. It sounded reasonable. But it also sounded practiced, like a line he had used before, and that was the problem. I did not know which parts of him were real and which parts were just something he had learned to say. And before I could push further, before I could decide whether to believe him or call him out on it, a voice cut through the noise again, familiar now in a way I did not like. "You are trending." And I did not have to turn to know it was Claire, her presence sharp without needing volume, her tone calm, but edged with something I could not quite place. And when I did look, she was already watching us. Not surprised, not curious, just aware, like she had been expecting this moment too. "That was fast," she added, her eyes flicking briefly to me before settling back on Lucas. And there was something in that look that made my chest tighten, not judgment exactly, but not neutral either, something measured, something that felt like she was trying to decide where I fit into all of this. "You should not be here," Lucas said, his tone polite but firm, the kind of voice that did not invite argument even when it sounded calm. But Claire did not move. Of course she did not. She never seemed like the type to back down just because someone told her to. "You should have handled it better," she replied just as evenly. And the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, because they were not just about the post or the rumors. They were about something else, something older, something that existed long before I got pulled into this, and I felt it then. That same realization from yesterday, but stronger now, clearer. This was not just about a fake relationship or a convenient solution. This was a situation that had been building for a while, and I was just the latest piece added to it. "I am handling it," Lucas said, his voice tightening just enough to give away that this was not as controlled as he wanted it to be. And Claire's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, like she had expected that answer. "By adding him," she said. And this time she looked at me directly, not sharp, not hostile, just direct, like she was speaking to me as much as him. "That is one way to do it." And I felt it again, that pressure, that sense of being part of something I did not fully understand. And for a second, I considered stepping back, creating distance, making it clear that whatever this was between them had nothing to do with me. But Lucas shifted just slightly beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, grounding without actually touching, and that tiny movement kept me where I was, kept me from pulling away even though part of me wanted to. "You are making assumptions," he said, his tone steady again, controlled, back in place, and Claire tilted her head just slightly, studying him like she was trying to see past that control, like she knew exactly where the cracks were even if no one else did. "I am making observations," she corrected, and then, quieter, just enough that it felt like the words were meant for me as much as him. "You should decide how much of this you want to believe." And that landed harder than anything else she had said, because it was not an attack, it was not even a warning, it was a choice, one I had not realized I was already being forced to make. And before I could respond, Before I could even figure out what I would say if I tried, she stepped back, giving us space like she had already said everything she needed to. "We will talk later," she added to Lucas. The same quiet certainty as before, and then she was gone, leaving the air behind her heavier, quieter, like something important had just shifted. And I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my thoughts catching up, rearranging, trying to make sense of what I had just heard, before I finally turned back to Lucas, searching his expression for something real, something unfiltered. "Is she right?" I asked quietly, and this time, when he looked at me, there was no immediate answer, no practiced line, just that same pause, that same careful silence, and I realized with a sinking certainty that whatever the truth was, I was already too far in to pretend it did not matter. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, and that was the problem, because Lucas Hale never hesitated unless there was something he was choosing not to say. And standing there in the middle of a hallway that suddenly felt too loud and too exposed, I realized I was not asking the right question anymore, because it was not just whether Claire was right, it was whether I even understood what I had agreed to in the first place. And the longer he said nothing, the more that doubt settled in, quiet but steady, filling in the gaps he kept leaving behind. "You should not listen to her," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, like he had already decided this was the answer I needed, not the truth I was asking for. And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what she had warned me about, not the lie itself, but the way he controlled what parts of the story I was allowed to see. And for a second, I considered pushing harder, demanding something clearer, something real, but the hallway was still full, people still watching, and I knew this was not the place, not the moment. "Then give me something else to listen to," I said instead, quieter, but sharper than before, and that got his attention in a way nothing else had all morning, his gaze locking onto mine fully now, not distant, not distracted, just focused, like he was reassessing something, recalculating again, and I hated how aware I was of that. How every time he looked at me like that it felt like he was making a decision I was not part of. "This is not as simple as it looks," he said. And there it was again, the half answer, the careful wording that explained nothing while sounding like it did, and something in me finally snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the way I was standing, the way I was looking at him. "Nothing about this looks simple," I replied, my voice still low but no longer uncertain, because that was the truth. It had not been simple from the moment he said my name in front of everyone, from the moment he decided I was part of whatever this was without telling me why. And for the first time, he did not immediately try to smooth it over, did not redirect or deflect. He just stood there, watching me, and I could see it now, clearer than before, that same tension in his jaw, that same subtle crack in the control he worked so hard to maintain. "You said you needed me to say yes," I continued, because if I stopped now I was not sure I would start again. "You said there was more, that you would tell me, but all I am getting are pieces that do not fit together." And the words came easier now, steadier, like something had finally aligned in my head. "So either I trust you without knowing anything, or I walk away before this turns into something I cannot get out of." And there it was, the line I had been circling since yesterday, clear and unavoidable, and for a second, I thought he might argue, might tell me I was overthinking it again, might fall back into that calm, controlled version of himself that kept everything just out of reach, but he did not. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but real, and that alone felt like a shift, like something had finally moved out of place. "You are not wrong," he said, and the honesty in that caught me off guard more than any denial would have, because Lucas Hale did not admit things easily, not without a reason, not without deciding it was necessary, and the fact that he was doing it now, here, meant something had changed, even if I did not know what yet. "There are people who benefit from me looking like I am lying," he added after a moment, his voice lower now, "not for the crowd, not for anyone else, just for me." And that sentence landed differently than everything else he had said so far, because it was not vague in the same way. It pointed somewhere, hinted at something beyond rumors and assumptions, something deliberate, and my thoughts shifted immediately, rearranging around that idea. "So this is not just about Claire," I said slowly, testing the ground, trying to see how much he would confirm. And he shook his head once, small but certain. "She is part of it, But not the whole, he replied. And that was the closest thing to a real answer I had gotten all day. Incomplete, but not empty. And I held on to that, even as more questions started forming, even as the situation grew more complicated instead of less, because now I knew one thing for sure. This was not random, not reactive. It was something that had been building long before I stepped into it. And the weight of that settled in my chest as we started walking again, slower this time, quieter, the noise of the hallway fading into the background as my focus narrowed on him, on what he was saying and what he was still holding back. And me, I said after a second, because I could not ignore that part anymore. Where do I fit into that? And he glanced at me briefly, something unreadable flickering in his expression before it settled again, but not as closed off as before, not as distant. You make it harder for them, he said, and the answer was simple, direct, and somehow heavier than everything else, because it meant I was not just a cover, not just a distraction. I was a problem for someone else, someone I had not even seen yet. And that realization should have made me step back, should have made me rethink everything. But instead, it pulled me in further, because now I wanted to know why. That is not exactly reassuring. I muttered, more to myself than to him, and he almost smiled again. Almost, the expression softening for just a second before fading. It is not supposed to be, he replied, and there was something in his voice this time, something less controlled, more real, like he was not trying to convince me anymore, just telling me what was true. And as we reached the end of the hallway, the noise returning, the attention shifting back toward us like it always did, I realized something I had not fully admitted until now. This was not just his situation anymore, it was mine too, and whether I stayed or walked away, I was already part of whatever came next. It should have felt like a warning when he said I made things harder for them. But instead it felt like a line I had already crossed without realizing it, because the moment we stepped into the next hallway, the attention did not fade. It sharpened, like people were not just curious anymore. They were waiting, watching for something specific, and I could not tell if it was us slipping up or something else entirely, something I had not seen yet. And that thought stayed with me as we walked, close enough to look convincing, not close enough to feel safe, and I hated how aware I was of that difference now, how every step felt measured, like I was part of something carefully controlled even when it did not feel that way. And before I could get lost in that spiral, my phone buzzed again, harder this time, the kind of vibration that demanded attention, and I hesitated for a second before checking it, already expecting more comments, more clips, more noise. But this was different, not a comment, not a rumor, a message, direct, from an unknown number, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, pretending I had not seen it. But something about the timing, the way everything had been building since this morning, made it impossible to look away, so I opened it. And the words were simple, almost too simple. You should ask him about last semester. And my stomach dropped slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden shift in context, because this was not vague like the comments. This was specific, deliberate, like whoever sent it knew exactly what they were pointing at. And before I could think it through, before I could decide whether to show him or keep it to myself, another message came through, faster this time, like they were watching me read it. He is not telling you everything. And that echoed too closely to what Claire had said, too closely to what I was already starting to believe, and I stopped walking without meaning to. The movement small, but enough for him to notice. Of course he noticed. He always noticed. What is it, Lucas? Asked, his voice lower now, sharper, like he already knew this was not just another notification. And for a second, I considered lying, saying it was nothing, keeping this part to myself until I understood it better, but that felt wrong in a way I could not justify, not when everything else between us was already built on half-truths and missing pieces. So instead, I turned the screen toward him, watching carefully, searching for that same reaction as before, that tiny crack in his control, and this time, it came faster, his expression tightening just slightly as he read the message. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. And that was all the confirmation I needed, because if it meant nothing, he would have dismissed it immediately, would have brushed it off like he did everything else, but he did not. And that silence, that hesitation, said more than any explanation could have. Do you want to explain that? I asked quietly, keeping my tone even though my thoughts were anything but. And he exhaled slowly, the the sound almost lost in the noise around us. But not quite. "It is nothing you need to worry about," he said, and there it was again, the same pattern, the same careful distance, the same decision to give me just enough to stay, but not enough to understand. And something in me pushed back against it this time, stronger than before, because now it was not just about trust, it was about choice, about whether I was going to keep accepting answers that did not actually answer anything. "You keep saying that," I replied, my voice still low, but no longer soft. "But everything I do not need to worry about keeps showing up anyway." And that landed. I could see it in the way his gaze shifted, in the way his jaw tightened just slightly, like he had expected resistance, but not this kind, not from me. And for a second, the control slipped again, just enough to show something real underneath, something closer to frustration than calm. "I am trying to keep you out of it," he said, and that should have sounded reassuring, should have made this easier to accept, but it did not, because it contradicted everything else, every look, every message, every piece of attention that had already pulled me in whether I wanted it or not. "That is not working," I said simply, because there was no point pretending otherwise anymore, and the truth of that hung between us, heavy and undeniable. And for a moment, neither of us moved, the hallway continuing around us like we were not standing in the middle of it, like this conversation was not happening in plain sight. And then he stepped closer, just a fraction, enough to shift the space between us, enough to ground the moment in something more focused, more private, even with people all around. And his voice dropped slightly, not for effect, not for anyone else, just for me. "Last semester does not change what is happening now," he said. And that was not a denial, not really. It was a redirection, a way to keep the focus here instead of there. And I recognized it immediately, which was almost worse than if I had not, because it meant I was starting to understand how he worked, how he chose what to say and what to leave out. And that realization settled in as I held his gaze, steady this time, not backing down. "It matters if someone thinks it does," I replied, and this time, he did not argue, did not correct me or dismiss it. He just watched me, something quieter in his expression now, something that felt less like control and more like consideration, like he was finally deciding whether to let me in or keep me at the edge of all of this. And the silence stretched again, but it felt different this time, heavier, more deliberate, like whatever came next was going to shift things in a way we could not undo. And for the first time since this started, I realized I was not just reacting anymore. I was waiting, actively waiting to see if he would finally choose to tell me the truth or keep me exactly where he wanted me, close enough to matter, but never close enough to understand. He could have told me then, right there in the middle of everything, and maybe that would have changed the direction of what came next. But Lucas Hale had never been the kind of person to give everything at once, and the way he held my gaze, steady but careful, told me he was still deciding how much I was allowed to know, and that realization should have made me step back, should have made me protect whatever part of my life was still untouched by all of this. But instead, it pulled me in deeper, because now I needed to understand what exactly I had stepped into last semester. I repeated quietly, not letting the moment pass, not letting him redirect again. And for a second, something shifted in his expression, subtle but real, like he had expected me to drop it, expected me to let him control the pace of this conversation the way he had been doing since the beginning. And when I did not, when I stayed exactly where I was, waiting, he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but heavier than before. "There was a situation," he said, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of vague answer I had been pushing against all day, and this time I did not let it slide. "That is not an explanation," I replied, my voice steady now, not uncertain, not hesitant, and something in the way I said it must have landed, because he did not try to smooth it over, did not fall back into that calm, controlled version of himself that made everything sound simple even when it was not. Instead, he looked at me for a second longer, like he was reassessing again, recalculating whether I was still someone he could keep at the edge of all this, or if I had already crossed into something else, something harder to manage. "Someone tried to make it look like I was involved in something I was not," he said finally. And the words were more direct than anything he had given me so far, but they still felt incomplete, like a piece of a larger picture I could not see yet. And my thoughts shifted immediately, connecting it to the post, to the comments, to the message I had just received, and suddenly it was not just random noise anymore. It was a pattern, something deliberate, something that had been building long before today. And it worked, I said slowly, not as a question, but as a realization, because if it had not, we would not be here. None of this would have escalated the way it had, and he did not deny it, did not correct me, just gave a small nod that confirmed everything I needed to know, and that settled something in me. Not comfort, not exactly, but clarity, because now I understood. At least part of why this was happening. Why he needed something convincing enough to shift the narrative, something people would believe without questioning. And that brought me back to the one thing that still did not make sense, the one question that had not changed since yesterday. So you picked me to fix it, I said, quieter now, not accusing, just stating what felt like the obvious conclusion. And for a moment, the air between us changed, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. Enough that it felt like something important was about to shift, because instead of agreeing, instead of confirming what would have been the easiest answer, he shook his head once, small but certain. No, he said, and that single word landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because it went against the logic of everything else, against the pattern I had been building in my head to make sense of this situation. And I frowned slightly, thrown off balance by that response. Then why? I asked. And this time, there was no hesitation, no careful pause while he chose his words, just a steady look that felt more direct than before, more intentional. Because I needed someone they could not predict, he said, and that answer settled differently. Not easy, not simple, but real in a way the others had not been, and my thoughts shifted again, adjusting to this new angle, this new understanding. Because it meant this was not just about convenience or control, it was about disruption. About introducing something into the situation that could not be easily manipulated or turned against him. And somehow, for some reason I did not fully understand, that was me. And the weight of that realization sat heavier than I expected, because it meant I was not just part of the story, I was part of the strategy, whether I had agreed to it knowingly or not. That does not exactly make me feel better, I admitted quietly, because it did not. It made everything feel more complicated, more deliberate, like every step I had taken since yesterday had been part of something bigger than I realized. And he almost smiled again, that same brief shift that never quite lasted long enough to fully form. It is not supposed to, he said, echoing his earlier words. But this time it felt different, less controlled, more honest, and that alone made it harder to argue, harder to push back the way I had been doing all morning, because for the first time, it did not feel like he was trying to convince me of something. It felt like he was just telling me the truth as much as he could, and that created a different kind of tension, not confusion, not frustration, but something quieter, something that sat between us as we stood there, aware of each other in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd or the attention or the story people were building around us. And for a moment, everything else faded just enough for me to notice it, the way he was looking at me now, not calculating, not distant, just present. And that was almost more unsettling than everything that had come before, because it made this feel less like a performance and more like something real, something that existed outside of the plan he had set in motion. And that was dangerous in a way I was not ready to define, because if this stopped being just strategy, if it started becoming something else, then walking away would not be as simple as it should have been. And that thought lingered as the noise of the hallway rushed back and around us, as people moved, as voices picked up again, as the world continued like nothing had shifted, even though everything had. And I realized then that whatever line I had been standing on before, the one between staying and leaving, between trusting and pulling back, it was already gone, replaced by something else entirely, something I had not chosen but was now part of anyway. And the only question left was how far this was going to go before I understood all of it, or before it became something I could not step away from even if I wanted to. It should have clarified things. Hearing him say it like that, hearing that I was not just a convenient choice but something unpredictable, something that could disrupt whatever was being built against him. But instead it made everything feel more complicated, because strategy was one thing, intention was another, and somewhere between the two was a line I could no longer see clearly. And as we moved through the rest of the hallway, the noise and attention folding back and around us like nothing had shifted, I could not shake the feeling that I had just stepped deeper into something I still did not fully understand. And that feeling only grew stronger when my phone buzzed again, not with a message this time, but with a notification that made my stomach drop the second I saw it. A new post, already gaining traction, already being shared, and I did not need to open it to know it was about him, about us, about everything that had been building since yesterday. But I did anyway, because not knowing felt worse than facing it directly. And the video loaded quickly, too quickly, like it had been waiting for me, and for a second, I did not understand what I was looking at, not because it was unclear, but because it did not match the version of Lucas I had seen so far, the calm, controlled, always composed version that never let anything slip. And yet here he was on screen, not out of control, not reckless, but different, sharper, more intense, speaking to someone just out of frame, his voice low but firm, his posture tense in a way I had not seen before. And there was nothing explicitly wrong about it, nothing that crossed a line, but the tone, the implication, the way the clip was cut and framed made it look like something else entirely, like something people could twist into whatever narrative they wanted, and judging by the comments already flooding in, that was exactly what they were doing. That is who he really is. Told you he was not clean. He has been hiding this. And I felt it then, that shift from curiosity to suspicion, from attention to judgment. And I looked up instinctively, searching for his reaction, for any sign that this was new information to him. But he was already watching me, not the phone, not the crowd, just me, like he was trying to read something in my expression before I even said a word. And that alone told me he knew about this too. Maybe not this exact clip, but the possibility of it, the way things could be presented, twisted, used. You want to tell me that is nothing I need to worry about too, I said quietly, not accusing, not yet, but not neutral either. And for a second, he did not answer, his gaze steady but heavier now, like he was weighing something more than just what to say next, like he was deciding how much of this he could still keep controlled and how much he was about to lose. It is incomplete, he said finally. And that answer landed differently than I expected, because it was not a denial, it was not an excuse, it was an admission that what I was seeing was not the whole picture, and that should have reassured me. But it did not, because incomplete meant there was more, and I was still only seeing fragments, still trying to piece together something that refused to stay still long enough to understand. Then what is the rest of it? I asked, because I was tired of guessing, tired of filling in gaps with assumptions that could be wrong. And this time, he did not look away, did not deflect, he just held my gaze, steady, deliberate. And for the first time, there was something else there, something quieter but stronger, something that felt less like control and more like resolve. Someone wants it to look like I cannot be trusted, he said. And the words were simple, direct, but they shifted everything again, because now it was not just about rumors or past situations, it was about intent. About someone actively shaping how he was seen, and my thoughts moved quickly, connecting it to the messages, to the posts, to Claire's warning, to everything that had been building around us since yesterday. And suddenly, this did not feel random at all. It felt coordinated, deliberate in a way that made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of how deep this might actually go. And this helps them, I said, more to myself than to him, because it was obvious now. The timing, the framing, the way it was spreading, and he nodded once, confirming it without needing to say anything else. And for a second, the noise of the hallway faded again, not completely, but enough that I could focus on the one thing that mattered in that moment, the decision I had been circling since all of this started, whether to step back now, while I still could, or to stay and see where this actually led. And the answer should have been simple. It should have been obvious, but it was not. Not anymore. Not after everything he had said. Not after the way this had unfolded. Not after the realization that I was not just part of the story, but part of whatever was being used to fight back against it. And before I could stop myself, before I could overthink it the way I had been doing all day, I made the choice, quiet but certain. Then you need to stop keeping me out of it, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. And that got a reaction, not dramatic, not obvious, but real. His expression shifting just enough to show that this was not what he had expected, not from me, not this soon. And for a second, something like hesitation flickered there, brief but undeniable. before settling into something else, something more grounded, more present, like he was adjusting to this new version of the situation, this version where I was not just reacting anymore, not just following his lead, but actively stepping into it beside him. That is not something I can control anymore, he said quietly, and the honesty in that felt different from everything else, less filtered, less measured, like he was no longer trying to maintain the same distance he had before. And that changed the space between us in a way I was not ready to fully process, because now it did not feel like I was being kept on the outside. It felt like I was standing right at the center of it with him. And that realization settled in as the noise returned, as people moved, as the world kept going like nothing had shifted, even though everything had. And I understood then that whatever this was, whatever had started with one sentence in front of the entire school, it was no longer just something I was caught in. It was something I had chosen to stay in, and that made all the difference in what came next. The moment I said it, the moment I chose to stay instead of stepping back, something shifted in a way I could not take back. Not in the hallway, not in the way people were watching, but in him, because Lucas did not respond right away, and that alone was enough to tell me this was different, that this was not part of whatever plan he had already set in motion. And for a second, I wondered if I had crossed a line I was not supposed to, if I had stepped into something he had been trying to keep separate on purpose. But then he nodded once, small but certain, and that was all it took to confirm it. I was in this now, not as a distraction, not as a cover, but as something else entirely, something closer to a choice than an accident. And the realization settled in just as the bell rang, loud and sharp, cutting through the tension like nothing had happened, like the world had not just shifted in a way only we could feel. And suddenly the hallway filled again, voices rising, lockers slamming, people moving, but the attention did not disappear. It never did. It just changed, sharper now, more focused, like they were not just watching us as a couple anymore. They were watching for cracks, for proof, for anything that confirmed the story they had already started building. And I felt it in every glance, every whisper that stopped just short of being obvious. And before I could adjust to that, before I could decide how to act in this new version of everything, Lucas moved closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough that his shoulder brushed mine briefly, intentional, grounding, and his voice dropped slightly, low enough that it did not carry beyond us. "Stay with me," he said, not like a command this time, not like something rehearsed, but like something real, something that did not belong to the act we were supposed to be playing. And that difference hit harder than I expected, because it meant this was not just about what people believed anymore. It was about what he needed, and for a second, I did not know how to respond to that. Did not know if I should treat it like everything else, like part of the performance, or if I should take it for what it sounded like, something honest, something unfiltered. And before I could decide, we were already moving again, walking through the crowd like we had done this 100 times before, like this was normal, like I belonged here. And that thought alone felt strange enough to slow my steps for half a second, because this was not my world. It never had been. And yet somehow, I was no longer standing outside of it. I was part of it. And that realization carried through the rest of the morning, through class, through the way people looked at me now, not like I was invisible, but like I was something they were trying to figure out, something that did not quite fit into the version of Lucas they thought they understood. And that difference was exactly what he had meant earlier. I made it harder for them, harder to predict, harder to control, and the weight of that sat differently now. Not just confusing, but intentional, like I had a role in this whether I fully understood it or not. And by the time lunch came around, the tension had shifted again, not gone, just redirected, like everything that had been building all day was about to converge into something more direct, more obvious. And I felt it the second we stepped into the cafeteria. The way conversations dipped just slightly, the way eyes followed us in a way that was no longer subtle, no longer trying to hide it. And I hesitated for half a second at the entrance, instinct kicking in again, telling me to turn around, to walk away before this escalated any further. But Lucas did not let that happen, his hand brushing lightly against my wrist, not gripping, not forcing, just there, steady, grounding. And I stayed, because that was what I had chosen. Because stepping back now would not undo anything that had already started, and we moved forward together, straight toward the center tables like yesterday, like nothing had changed even though everything had. And this time, the silence that followed was not just curiosity, it was expectation, like they were waiting for something specific. And it came faster than I expected, not from one of his usual circle, not from someone trying to joke or test the situation, but from across the table, a phone sliding forward just enough for both of us to see the screen, paused on the same video I had watched earlier, the one that had already started, shaping a different narrative around him, and the guy holding it leaned back slightly, casual but not relaxed, his gaze fixed on Lucas in a way that felt more deliberate than curious. "You want to explain that?" he said, and the room did not go silent completely, but it got quieter, enough that the question carried, enough that it mattered, and I felt it then, that shift again. The moment where everything could tilt one way or the other depending on what happened next, and instinctively, I glanced at Lucas, expecting that same calm response, that same controlled deflection he had used before, but this time, something was different, not obvious, not dramatic, just a fraction slower, a fraction heavier, like this was not just another moment he could navigate easily, like this one mattered more than the others. And for the first time since this started, I realized something I had not fully considered before. Maybe I was not the only one being pulled into this. Maybe Lucas was too. And whatever was coming next was not just about what people believed. It was about what we were willing to stand behind when it stopped being easy. For a second, no one moved. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. Because even though the cafeteria was still full, still loud in the background, everything around that table narrowed into something tighter, sharper, like the question had pulled all the attention into one place and refused to let it go. And I could feel it, that weight of expectation pressing in from every direction, waiting for Lucas to respond, waiting for him to either confirm what they were starting to believe or shut it down before it spread any further. And I glanced at him again, instinctively, because this was still his world, his circle, his problem, except it did not feel that simple anymore. Not after everything that had happened, not after the way things had shifted between us. And this time, he did not look calm in the same effortless way he usually did. Not entirely. There was still control, still that steady composure he never seemed to lose, but underneath it, just barely visible, there was something else, something more deliberate, like he was choosing his next move carefully instead of reacting automatically. And that alone told me this mattered more than the others. "It is a clip," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but not dismissive, not brushing it off like it meant nothing. And the guy across the table leaned back slightly, unimpressed, like that answer was not going to be enough. "Looks like more than that," he replied, casual but pointed. And a few people around the table shifted just enough to show they were listening more closely now, not pretending anymore. And I felt it again. That shift from curiosity to judgment. The moment where things stopped being speculation and started becoming something people would hold on to. Something that would define the story moving forward if it was not handled carefully. And Lucas knew that. I could see it in the way his gaze flicked briefly to the phone before returning to the guy across from him. Steady, direct, not avoiding it, not backing down. "It is incomplete," he repeated, and this time, the word carried more weight, more intention, like he was not just stating a fact but setting a boundary. And there was a beat of silence after that, not long, but enough for the tension to stretch, for people to decide whether they believed that or not. And I could already tell some of them did not. I could see it in the way they looked at him, in the way their expressions did not fully settle, like they were waiting for something more, something clearer, something that confirmed what they thought they were seeing. And before I could stop myself, before I could overthink it the way I usually did, I spoke. "You are missing the context," I said, my voice steady even though my thoughts were anything but. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, that shift, not just from the table but from him, because this was not part of the plan, not something he had asked for. And yet I had stepped into it anyway, not as a reaction, not as a cover, but as a choice. And the guy across from us looked at me now, really looked, like I had just moved from background to something else entirely. "And you know the context?" he asked, not mocking, not aggressive, just direct. And for a second, I hesitated, not because I did not have an answer, but because I realized I did not actually know everything. Not fully, not completely, but I knew enough to understand that what they were seeing was not the whole picture, enough to recognize that this was exactly what Lucas had been talking about. and that was all I needed. I know it is not what you think it is, I replied, and the words landed somewhere between certainty and trust. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And for a moment, the table went quiet again, not because that answered everything, but because it changed the dynamic, shifted the focus just enough that this was no longer just about Lucas defending himself. It was about both of us standing behind the same version of the story, and I felt it then, that subtle change in the air, the way the attention adjusted, recalibrated, like they were reassessing not just him but us. And when I glanced at him again, just for a second, I saw it, that same flicker I had been noticing all day, but stronger this time, clearer, something less controlled, less calculated, something closer to surprise, and maybe something else I was not ready to name. And it only lasted a second before he looked away, before he shifted back into that steady composure. But it was enough to tell me that this had not been expected, that I had stepped into something he had been holding on his own. And for a moment, the tension eased just slightly, not gone, not resolved, but redirected, like the question had not been answered completely, but had lost some of its edge, some of its certainty. And that was all it needed to shift the conversation, to move things forward without letting it spiral further. And as people started talking again, quieter now, more cautious, I realized something I had not fully understood until that moment. This was not just about protecting him or proving something to everyone else. It was about choosing a side, choosing what version of the story I was going to stand behind even without knowing every detail. And that choice had consequences, not just for him, but for me too, because now I was not just part of the narrative, I was part of the defense, part of whatever came next. And as we sat there, close but not touching, aware of each other in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd around us, I understood that this was the point where things stopped being reversible, where staying meant more than just playing along. It meant being involved in a way I could not easily step away from later. And for the first time since all of this started, I did not feel like I was being pulled into something unknown. I felt like I had stepped into it on my own. And that made everything that came next matter even more. It should have ended there. Just a moment at a table where the tension eased enough for people to look away and pretend it was over. But things like this do not end that cleanly. Not when they have already spread too far. Not when people have already decided there is more beneath the surface. And I felt it even as the conversation shifted, even as trays moved and voices picked back up, because the attention did not disappear. It just changed direction, quieter now, more deliberate, like they were no longer looking for something obvious. They were waiting for something to slip, something that would confirm everything they had started to believe. And I sat there, more aware than ever of the space between us, the way our shoulders almost touched but did not, the way every small movement felt like it mattered more than it should have. And for a second, I wondered if this was what he had been dealing with all along, this constant pressure of being watched, measured, interpreted. And if that was the case, then maybe I had underestimated what it meant to step into his world, because this was not just attention, it was expectation, and that expectation followed us when we stood up, when we moved through the cafeteria, when we walked out into the hallway again, quieter now, but no less focused. And I did not realize how much it had settled into me until we were outside, until the air shifted just enough to make it easier to breathe. And even then, it did not go away completely. It lingered, like something unfinished, something waiting, and Lucas stopped a few steps ahead of me, not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, just enough to create a pause between us. And when I caught up, he turned slightly, not fully, just enough that I could see his expression clearly for the first time since everything had escalated. And it was different, not controlled in the same effortless way, not distant, but something else, something quieter, more grounded, like whatever had been building all day had finally settled into something real. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice low, steady, but without the usual edge of calculation. And I knew what he meant, not just the moment at the table, not just the way I had spoken up, but the choice behind it, the decision to stand there instead of stepping back. And I could have brushed it off, could have said it was nothing, that it did not matter, but that would have been a lie, and I was already tired of those. "I know," I replied simply, because that was the truth. I did not have to, I chose to, and the weight of that settled between us in a way that felt different from everything else. Not tension, not confusion, but something more certain, something that did not need to be explained, and for a second, neither of us said anything, not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever this was, it did not fit into the same pattern as before. It was not part of the act, not something rehearsed or controlled. It was just there, and that made it harder to ignore, harder to define, and before I could get lost in that thought, my phone buzzed again, sharp and sudden, pulling me back into everything we had been trying to navigate all day, and I hesitated for a second before checking it, already expecting more noise, more speculation, more of the same. But this time, it was different. Not a message, not a comment, a new post, already spreading faster than the others. And something about the timing, the way it appeared right after everything had shifted, made my chest tighten slightly as I opened it, and the image loaded slowly, just enough to make the anticipation worse. And when it finally appeared, it took me a second to process what I was seeing, not because it was unclear, but because it connected too many things at once. A photo, not recent, not from today, from last semester, showing Lucas standing with someone I recognized immediately, not from personal experience, but from everything that had been said, everything that had been hinted at, Claire, and the caption beneath it was simple, direct in a way that left no room for interpretation. So this is the truth they are hiding, and the comments were already building, drawing lines, connecting stories, reshaping everything that had happened over the past 2 days into something else entirely, something that made this look less like a strategy and more like a cover, and I felt it then, that shift again, sharper this time, heavier, because this was not just a question anymore. It was a narrative, one that was being built in real time, one that was pulling everything into it whether we wanted it to or not. And I looked up slowly, my thoughts catching up as I turned toward him, searching his expression for something, anything that would make this clearer. And this time, there was no delay, no hesitation, just that same steady gaze, but without the distance, without the control he had been holding onto all day. "That is not what it looks like," he said, and for the first time since this started, it did not sound like a deflection, it did not sound like something meant to redirect or avoid, it sounded like something real, something he needed me to believe. And the difference was subtle but undeniable, and I realized then that this was the moment everything had been building toward, not the rumors, not the videos, not the questions at the table, but this, the point where the story being told about him and the truth he had been holding back were about to collide. And whatever happened next was not going to be something we could control the same way we had before, because now it was not just about what people believed, it was about what I was willing to believe. And standing there, with the noise of everything else fading just enough to focus on him, I understood that this was where the real choice began, not whether to stay or leave, but whether to trust what I had seen in him beneath all of this, or to believe the version being pushed in front of me. And the answer was not as simple as it should have been, not anymore.